Imagine a night so cold, it bites through your clothes, freezes your breath, and leaves you huddled with your family for warmth. No heaters, no blankets, no escape, just fire, straw, and sheer endurance. Tonight, we take you deep into the harsh world of medieval peasants, revealing how they survived the deadliest, frostiest nights. Prepare to step back in time and experience winter like never before. Hi guys, tonight we will talk about how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. Before start, please like and subscribe. My channel Sleepsy, and also let men know in the comment your country name and what it is the time for you. It always fascinated to join us all over the world. Now, dim the light, take a deep breath, and let's start our journey tonight. Night did not arrive gently in the medieval world. It did not fade in behind glowing windows or street lamps. It came suddenly, like a heavy door closing on the land. As the sun slipped behind distant hills, the countryside fell into a darkness we can hardly imagine today. No soft lights in the distance, no hum of electricity, no comforting glow leaking through curtains. When daylight ended, the world truly went black. For medieval peasants, night was not a pause from life. It was a test they faced every single day. The fields that had been noisy with work only hours before became silent. Tools were set aside. Animals were gathered close. Smoke from hearth fires rose briefly into the evening air, then disappeared into the cold sky. Soon, even those signs of life vanished. What remained was darkness, cold and waiting. There were no streetlights guiding the way home, no clocks glowing on walls, no weather forecasts. A peasant judged the coming night by the wind on their skin and the color of the sky. When winter approached, the signs were impossible to ignore. The days grew shorter. The sun stayed low, and night arrived earlier with every passing week. In winter, darkness ruled most of the day. A peasant might wake before sunrise and finish work long after the sun had already disappeared. When night came, it did not feel like rest. It felt like exposure. The medieval countryside after sunset was unnervingly quiet, not peaceful, empty. Sound traveled far in the cold air. A snapping branch echoed like a warning. The wind moved through bare trees with a hollow sound, like breathing. Inside their homes, peasants listened closely. Outside, the world felt vast and hostile. Wolves still roamed forests and fields. Foxes crept near villages. Sometimes hunger drove animals dangerously close to human dwellings. A distant howl in the night was not a story or a symbol. It was a real sound with real consequences. But animals were not the greatest threat of the night. Cold was. Cold crept in slowly, then all at once. It slipped through walls. It crawled along the floor. It settled into bones. There was no escaping it. Medieval peasants lived without central heating, without insulation as we know it, without the ability to raise a thermostat or close double-glazed windows. When the temperature dropped, their homes dropped with it. Night made everything worse. During the day, movement kept bodies warm. Work created heat. The sun, even weak and pale, offered some comfort. But at night, stillness took over, and stillness invited the cold. Winter nights were longer than modern people realize. Before artificial light, darkness dictated behavior. In deep winter, peasants could experience 14 or more hours of night. That meant 14 hours of managing cold, fear, hunger, and exhaustion. And sleep did not come easily. The moment darkness fell, a peasant's world shrank. Their entire existence narrowed to a small space, a single room, a single fire, a handful of people and animals pressed close together. Beyond those walls, the night felt endless. The cold after dusk was not sudden. It was patient. It arrived in layers. First the air cooled, Then the floor hardened. Then fingers stiffened, breath grew shallow, and the fire seemed smaller than it had hours before. Peasants knew this feeling well. They had no word for wind chill, but they understood it deeply. A strong winter wind could turn a tolerable evening into a dangerous night. Drafts slipped through every gap in walls and roofs. Smoke from the fire shifted unpredictably, stinging eyes and lungs. Even indoors, there was no true shelter. Yet, peasants endured. They did not see the cold as an emergency. They saw it as a season. Cold was not something to escape. It was something to survive. Children learned this early. Elders carried it in their joints. Every family knew that winter nights would come, whether they were ready or not. And preparation mattered more than comfort. As night deepened, activity slowed. Candles were precious and rarely burned long. Most homes relied on firelight, which flickered and danced across rough walls, casting moving shadows that seemed alive. These shadows fed fear. The medieval night was filled with beliefs, spirits, demons, wandering souls. Winter was thought to thin the veil between worlds. Darkness invited thoughts that daylight kept away. A creaking roof was not just wood shifting, it was a warning. A sudden gust was not just wind, it carried meaning. Storytelling helped push back against this fear. So did prayer. So did simple routines repeated night after night, winter after winter. Still, the cold remained. As families settled in, they listened to the sounds of the house, the soft rustle of straw, the breathing of animals, the snap of cooling wood. These were signs of life, proof that warmth still existed. Outside, frost formed silently. The ground hardened, streams slowed beneath thin ice. The world held its breath. Inside, peasants prepared for the longest hours of the day. Night was not just darkness, it was vulnerability. A weak fire could mean illness. A draft could mean frostbitten fingers. A long night could mean hunger by morning. Yet millions survived these nights, generation after generation, without complaint, without comfort, and without choice. They did not conquer the cold, they lived alongside it. And as the wind pressed against their homes and the fire settled into glowing embers, medieval peasants did what they always did when night fell. They waited, they endured, and they trusted that morning would come. The cold of the medieval world was not the cold we know today. It was heavier, it lingered longer, and it shaped every part of daily life. When winter arrived, it did not come with a clear beginning or end. There were no forecasts, no warnings, no certainty. A peasant felt winter in their hands before they saw it in the sky. The air grew sharper, the ground stiffened beneath their feet. Breath began to show, even indoors. Medieval winters were often colder than modern ones. Historians now call this long period of chill the Little Ice Age. It was not one single winter, but centuries of colder seasons that reshaped Europe's climate. Snow stayed longer, rivers froze deeper, harvests failed more often. For peasants, this was not an event to study. It was simply reality. The cold did not stay outside. It moved freely through homes, clothing, and bodies. Walls were thin. Roofs leaked air. Floors pulled warmth from bare feet. Even when the fire burned, warmth remained uneven and uncertain. A peasant standing close to the hearth felt heat on one side and cold on the other. Step away, and the warmth vanished almost instantly. There was no room where the temperature stayed the same. Cold ruled everything. Modern people think of cold as something temporary, something solved by layers, heaters, and insulated spaces. Medieval peasants had none of this security. Their world offered no escape from winter. Clothing helped, but only so much. Fire helped, but never enough. Shelter helped, but only barely. Insulation, as we understand it, did not exist. Walls were packed with mud, straw, and animal hair, but drafts always found a way through. Roofs were made of thatch, thick but imperfect. Gaps opened as materials aged. Wind slipped inside unnoticed. Even the fire itself worked against them. Most homes had open hearths with no chimney. Smoke lingered in the room, stinging eyes and throats. Opening gaps for smoke meant inviting cold air inside. It was always a trade-off. Peasants learned to accept discomfort as normal. Warmth was not a constant state. It came in brief moments, near the fire, during work, beside another body. The idea of being fully warm throughout the night would have seemed unrealistic, even wasteful. Winter clothing was limited by available materials. There were no synthetic fibers, no waterproof layers, no fleece. Wool was the primary defense against cold. It trapped heat even when damp, but it was heavy and rough. Linen offered little warmth. Leather blocked wind but not cold. Fur was rare and expensive, usually reserved for the wealthy. A peasant wore what they owned, and they owned very little. Most families had one set of winter clothing per person. Garments were repaired endlessly, patches layered over patches, sleeves shortened, hems raised, fabric reused until nothing remained. Removing clothes at night made no sense. Sleeping meant staying dressed. Sometimes cloaks stayed on. Hoods were pulled tight. Warmth was preserved wherever possible. Yet even layered in wool, the cold still crept in. Hands ached, feet stiffened. Sleep became shallow. But peasants did not describe this as suffering. It was simply winter. The medieval mind did not expect comfort. It expected endurance. Life was not designed to be easy. It was designed to continue. Cold became a companion, not an emergency. It was discussed casually, managed quietly, endured without drama. Children grew up learning how to move slowly in winter, how to save energy, how to stay close to others. Elders taught by example, conserving warmth and strength. The cold shaped behavior. People spoke less at night to save breath. Movements were deliberate. Fires were watched carefully, never allowed to burn too fast. Every decision revolved around preservation. Winter nights were especially dangerous because stillness allowed cold to settle deep into the body. Once chilled, it was hard to warm again. Peasants knew this instinctively. That is why activity continued even late into the evening. Tools were repaired, animals checked, food prepared slowly near the fire. Movement created warmth, and warmth meant survival. There was no belief that winter was unfair. It was part of the natural order. Cold tested the strong and the weak alike. Illness followed cold closely. A long winter weakened bodies. Hunger made warmth harder to maintain. Many did not survive the season, and this was expected. Yet humanity persisted. Across villages and centuries, peasants adapted not by conquering cold, but by accepting its presence. They built their lives around it. They lowered expectations and raised endurance. Cold was not an enemy to defeat. It was a force to live alongside. And as night settled in and the temperature dropped once more, medieval peasants prepared themselves again, not with hope for comfort, but with quiet determination to last until morning. A medieval peasant's home was not built to impress. It was built to endure. From the outside, these homes looked small and fragile, but every part of them existed for a reason. They were shaped by cold, scarcity, and the need to survive long winters with limited resources. Most peasant houses were made from wattle and daub. Thin wooden sticks were woven together to form walls, then packed with mud, clay, straw, and animal hair. When dry, this mixture hardened into a rough surface that blocked wind better than bare wood. It was not pretty, but it worked. The walls were thick, uneven, and dark. They absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Cracks formed over time, but these were often filled again with fresh mud. Maintenance never stopped. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. A good thatch was thick and heavy, layered carefully to shed rain and snow. When done well, it provided surprising insulation. When neglected, it leaked cold air and moisture relentlessly. Inside, light was limited. Windows were small, sometimes nothing more than a hole with a wooden shutter. Glass was rare and expensive. At night, shutters were closed tightly, shutting out wind and darkness together. Fresh air was not a priority, warmth was. Homes were low to the ground. Ceilings were kept deliberately low to trap heat. Heat rises, and peasants wanted it as close to their bodies as possible. Tall spaces wasted warmth they could not afford to lose. The result was a cramped interior. One main room served nearly every purpose of life. Cooking, eating, working, sleeping, all happened in the same space. Privacy did not exist in the modern sense. Neither did separate bedrooms. But closeness had a benefit. Bodies generated heat. The smaller the space, the easier it was to keep warm. The floor was usually bare earth. Sometimes it was packed hard, sometimes softened with straw. Stone floors were rare and cold. Earth, while damp, held some warmth and could be covered as needed. In winter, fresh straw was spread across the floor. It absorbed moisture, softened the ground, and added a thin layer of insulation. Cleanliness mattered less than survival. Furniture was minimal: a table, a bench, a chest. Most items were built from rough wood and repaired repeatedly. Anything unnecessary was removed. Clutter blocked movement and wasted space. The hearth sat at the center of the home. There was no chimney. Smoke escaped through the roof or small openings near the ceiling. The air inside was thick and heavy, especially at night. Breathing smoke was unpleasant, but the alternative was worse. The fire's warmth spread unevenly. The area closest to the hearth was precious. Elderly family members and small children stayed there. Others arranged themselves wherever space allowed. Walls darkened with soot over time. Beams blackened. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, hair, and skin. It became part of daily life. Despite the discomfort, the home provided shelter from the worst of the night. Wind was softened. Snow stayed outside. Darkness was held back by firelight. And sometimes, warmth remained. One of the most surprising features of peasant homes was the presence of animals. Cows, goats, sheep, and pigs were often kept indoors at night, especially during winter. This was not carelessness, it was strategy. Animals produced heat. Their breath warmed the air. Their bodies radiated warmth slowly and constantly. Sharing space with livestock made a measurable difference during cold nights. The smell was strong, noise was constant, disease was a risk. But warmth mattered more than comfort. Humans and animals lived side by side, bound by necessity. Every design choice reflected compromise. Smoke for warmth, darkness for insulation, crowding for survival. A peasant did not expect their home to protect them completely. It only needed to protect them enough to last the night, enough to reach morning. The house was not a refuge from winter. It was a thin barrier against it. And when the wind howled outside and frost crept across the land, peasants gathered inside these small, dark spaces and trusted their homes to do what they were built for, not to comfort, but to endure. Fire was life inside a medieval peasant's home. Without it, winter nights would have been impossible to survive. There were no heaters, no stoves, no backup sources of warmth. The fire was the only defense against cold, darkness, and fear. Every evening, as the light faded, attention turned to the hearth. The hearth was not a fireplace as we imagine it today. It was an open fire set directly on the floor or on a low stone base. There was no chimney. Smoke rose upward and drifted slowly through the room before escaping through gaps in the roof. This made the air thick and sharp. Eyes burned, throats ached, but firelight pushed back the darkness, and warmth spread just enough to matter. Firewood was precious. Every log mattered. Peasants could not afford to burn freely. Wood had to be gathered, dried, and rationed carefully. In some places, taking wood from forests was restricted by law. Winter shortages were common. Because of this, fires were kept small. A large, roaring blaze looked comforting, but it wasted fuel. Instead, peasants learned to build slow, steady fires that lasted through the night. As evening approached, the fire was adjusted. Larger pieces of wood were placed carefully. Embers were spread and covered with ash to preserve heat. The goal was not brightness, it was endurance. A good fire was one that survived until morning. Someone always watched it. Letting the fire die completely was dangerous. Relighting it meant using extra fuel or borrowing embers from a neighbor. In deep winter, a dead hearth could be deadly. Children were warned away from the fire, yet drawn to it instinctively. Elderly family members sat closest. Everyone knew their place around the hearth. Fire shaped the rhythm of the night. It provided light for final tasks, mending clothes, checking tools, stirring food. Shadows moved across the walls as flames flickered. The room felt alive, breathing with the fire, but fire came with a cost. Smoke never truly left the house. It settled into beams and walls. Over time, it coated everything in black soot. Peasants lived with irritated lungs and stinging eyes. Many suffered long-term breathing problems. Coughing was common. Soot clung to hair and skin. Yet there was no alternative. Clean air meant cold. Smoke meant warmth. Fire also provided protection. Its light discouraged animals from approaching too closely. Wolves avoided the glow. Foxes kept their distance. Fire marked human presence in a dark world. At night, the fire became a comfort. Its crackling sound reassured families that warmth still existed. Even when embers dimmed, the glow offered a sense of safety. Peasants learned to read the fire, the color of embers, the sound of burning wood. A fire that popped too loudly wasted fuel. A fire that faded too quickly warned of a cold night ahead. Before sleeping, ashes were carefully arranged. Hot coals were buried slightly to slow their burn. This technique could keep a hearth warm for hours. No one slept deeply. The fire demanded attention. If the wind changed direction, smoke shifted. If the embers cooled too fast, someone woke to adjust them. Fire made sleep possible, but it never allowed complete rest. Yet without it, survival would have been unthinkable. Fire was warmth, light, and reassurance all at once. It was the center of the home, physically and emotionally. Families gathered around it instinctively, drawn by heat and habit. In the medieval world, fire was not background comfort. It was constant responsibility. And as the night grew colder and frost formed outside unseen, peasants relied on their hearth, the small, fragile heart of their home, to carry them safely through the darkness. When night settled fully over a medieval village, sleep did not look the way we imagine it today. There were no quiet bedrooms, no soft mattresses waiting behind closed doors. Sleep was communal, practical, and shaped by cold. Warmth came from bodies. Most peasant families slept in the same room they worked and ate in during the day. Often, everyone slept together, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents. Space was limited, and separation meant losing precious heat. Beds were simple, a wooden frame, or sometimes just a raised platform. On top lay a mattress stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried leaves. These materials shifted during the night, flattening under weight, but they trapped a small amount of warmth. Wool blankets covered the sleepers, heavy, rough, and worn thin by years of use. Sometimes there were only 1 or 2 blankets for the entire family. People arranged themselves carefully. The weakest slept closest to the center. Children were placed between adults. Elderly family members were tucked near the warmest bodies. This was not sentiment. It was survival. Privacy had no place here. Cold erased it completely. Sharing a bed was normal. It was expected. Sleeping alone in winter made little sense and carried real risk. Body heat was the most reliable form of insulation available. Clothing stayed on. Tunics, trousers, woolen hose. Whatever a peasant owned, they wore to bed. Removing clothes wasted warmth and invited cold into the body. Cloaks were sometimes pulled over sleepers like extra blankets. Hoods stayed up. Hands were tucked under bodies or between knees to protect fingers from stiffening overnight. Movement was limited. Too much shifting let cold air in. Sleep was light and shallow, broken by sounds, by fire checks, by the creeping chill that settled as the night deepened. Yet there was comfort in closeness. Breathing slowed together. The rhythm of sleep became shared. The room filled with the quiet sounds of life. Breath, straw rustling, the fire settling into embers. Children grew used to this from birth. Warmth meant being close. Safety meant being together. Even adults found reassurance in shared sleep. In darkness, when fear stirred easily, the presence of others pushed back loneliness and uncertainty. This was not romantic. It was practical. Illness spread more easily this way. Lice were common, fleas lived in bedding, but separating sleepers was a luxury peasants could not afford. Cold decided everything. During the coldest nights, families packed tighter. Extra straw was added. Blankets were layered. Sometimes animals slept nearby, adding warmth to the air. Sleep came in fragments. People woke often. Someone might rise to tend the fire, check animals, or simply shift position to regain warmth. No one expected uninterrupted rest. Peasants did not measure sleep in hours. They measured it in survival. If they woke in the morning, the night had been successful. And so, night after night, winter after winter, medieval peasants slept not in silence and space, but in closeness and shared warmth, trusting one another's bodies to hold back the cold just long enough to see the dawn. In the medieval world, clothing was not fashion, it was protection. Every layer a peasant owned stood between their body and the cold night. There were no wardrobes filled with choices. Most people owned only a few garments, and each one had to last for years. Wool was the foundation of winter survival. Sheep were common, and wool was one of the few materials that could be produced locally. It trapped warmth even when damp and blocked wind better than most fabrics available at the time. But wool was heavy, it scratched, and it never fully dried in winter. Still, peasants depended on it completely. A typical peasant wore a wool tunic over a linen undergarment. In winter, extra layers were added. Another tunic, a thick cloak, or a hood pulled tightly around the head. Hoods were especially important. Heat escaped quickly from the head, and covering it made a noticeable difference. Many peasants slept with their hoods on, even indoors. There were no specialized night clothes. Sleeping meant wearing everything you had. Removing clothes at bedtime would have wasted heat built up during the day. Instead, peasants loosened belts, adjusted layers, and lay down as they were. Clothing was repaired constantly. Tiers were stitched. Worn areas were patched. Old garments were cut down to fit children or reused as linings. Nothing was thrown away. A cloak might serve as daytime protection, nighttime blanket, and emergency insulation all at once. Its value went far beyond appearance. Footwear mattered too. Leather shoes blocked wind but offered little warmth. In winter, peasants stuffed straw or cloth inside shoes to add insulation. At night, shoes were often kept near the fire, so they would not freeze stiff by morning. Hands suffered the most. Gloves were rare and impractical for work. Many peasants slept with their hands tucked inside sleeves or pressed against their bodies to keep fingers flexible. Clothing absorbed smoke, sweat, and dirt. Washing in winter was difficult and dangerous. Wet clothes could lead to illness. As a result, garments stayed on for weeks at a time. Cleanliness was sacrificed for warmth. The smell of wool, smoke, and human bodies filled peasant homes. It became familiar, even comforting. It meant life was still present. Children learned early how to manage layers. Elders taught them when to add cloth and when to conserve it. Every piece mattered. There was no concept of too many layers. Bulk was inconvenient, but cold was unforgiving. Even in bed, clothing remained armor. Bodies wrapped in wool held heat longer. Breath warmed the fabric near the face. Movement slowed to preserve warmth. Peasants did not dream of lighter clothes or better materials. They worked with what they had. Survival came from care, repair, and patience. Clothing did not eliminate cold, it delayed it. And in a world where every hour of warmth mattered, delay was often enough. As night deepened and fires dimmed, medieval peasants trusted their layers, heavy, worn, and imperfect, to shield them through the coldest hours until morning returned. In a medieval peasant's home, warmth did not come from machines or materials designed in factories. It came from the land itself. Straw, hay, mud, and earth became the quiet defenders against winter cold. The floor of most peasant homes was bare earth, hard-packed dirt that stayed cool even in summer and cold in winter. Stone floors were rare and unforgiving. Earth, while far from comfortable, held a small amount of warmth and could be softened. As winter approached, fresh straw was spread across the floor. This was not decoration, it was insulation. Straw trapped air. It created a thin barrier between bare feet and frozen ground. It absorbed moisture and reduced drafts creeping along the floor. Over time, straw flattened, grew dirty, and smelled strongly. It was replaced when possible, but often it remained in place for weeks or months. Clean floors were a luxury. Warm floors were survival. Bedding followed the same logic. Mattresses were sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or chaff, the leftover husks from grain. These materials shifted during sleep, poking and flattening, but they held warmth better than nothing. Each night, peasants adjusted their bedding, shaking straw into place, adding more when available. A thin layer could make the difference between sleep and shivering. Walls also held the land inside them. Wattle and daub was a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal hair. When fresh, it sealed gaps. When dry, it hardened into a barrier against wind. Cracks formed as walls aged. These were filled again and again with mud. Maintenance never stopped, especially before winter. Every small gap mattered. Even roofs relied on natural materials. Thatched straw roofs were thick and layered. A well-maintained thatch shed rain and snow while trapping heat below. But time weakened everything. Straw shifted. Gaps opened. Wind found its way inside. Peasants learned to live with imperfection. Straw also appeared in unexpected places. It was stuffed into clothing for extra insulation, packed around doors and windows to block drafts, used to wrap tools and water containers to prevent freezing. Earth itself helped in quiet ways. Thick walls absorbed heat from the fire during the evening and released it slowly through the night. This made the cold arrive more gradually. Nothing stayed warm for long, but every delay mattered. Cleanliness was sacrificed without hesitation. Fleas lived in straw, dirt clung to bedding. But removing straw meant losing insulation. Winter demanded choices, and warmth always won. Children grew up used to sleeping on uneven bedding. Adults learned how to position themselves for the best warmth. Bodies adapted to discomfort. Nature was not shaped to fit human comfort. Humans shaped their lives to fit nature. Straw, hay, and earth were never perfect solutions. They did not stop cold completely, but they softened it, slowed it, and made survival possible. And as the night grew quieter and frost crept across the land, peasants lay down on the very materials they harvested, trusting the earth itself to help them endure until morning. In the medieval countryside, the line between humans and animals was thin. Peasants relied on animals not just for food or work, but for warmth. During the harshest winter nights, cows, goats, pigs, and sometimes chickens were brought indoors. This was not carelessness, it was survival. Animals produce constant heat. Their bodies radiated warmth slowly into the surrounding air. When packed together in the same small room, humans benefited from this living furnace. Cows pressed close to the walls, goats nestle near the hearth, pigs huddle beside children. Each animal added a few precious degrees to the cold air. The smell was strong and sometimes overpowering. The noise was constant. Animals shifted in sleep, snorted, and occasionally kicked. Yet, these were small inconveniences compared to the danger of frostbite or hypothermia. Peasants accepted this trade. Warmth mattered more than comfort. Disease risk mattered less than survival. Every layer of warmth counted. This was not just a strategy for a single night. It was part of a long, repeated cycle. Every winter, families brought animals inside. Every winter, smoke, noise, and odor became part of the home's life. Children grew up knowing the smell of hay, sweat, and livestock. They learned which animals were safest to sleep near. They learned to move carefully to avoid being kicked or stepped on. Every sound became familiar, comforting even, because it meant life was still present. Animals also offered security beyond warmth. Their presence deterred predators. Wolves and foxes kept their distance from the human-animal household. Even the faint glow of a hearth, combined with the movement of animals, signaled human life in a dark, dangerous world. It was a delicate balance. Too many animals crowded the space and risked suffocation or panic. Too few, and cold crept deeper into the night. Peasants constantly adjusted their living arrangements, learning from experience what worked best. No one slept alone. Human bodies and animal bodies intertwined, sharing the heat that each produced. Even at rest, survival required awareness. Someone always remained slightly alert, checking the fire, the animals, and the room's overall warmth. There was no shame in this closeness. It was practical. Necessity defined it, not social norms. Comfort and privacy were luxuries that the poor could not afford. Survival came first. By the middle of the night, the room became a living furnace. Heat radiated from human and animal bodies. Cold air slowed its invasion, pressing only at the edges. If the fire died, the room still held warmth, thanks to breathing, movement, and shared body heat. The practice was not without risk. Disease spread more easily. Fleas and lice thrived in straw and fur. Waste needed constant attention. But winter nights were dangerous in ways that dirt and discomfort could not compete with. Animals in the house were not just companions, they were lifelines. They reminded peasants that survival was a collective effort. Humans, animals, fire, and shelter, all working together against the cold. Every night was a rehearsal, a practice in endurance. And when dawn finally arrived, the warmth of living bodies was still present, carrying people through the final hours of darkness until sunlight returned. In medieval homes, heat was not measured in degrees. It was measured in bodies, in breath, and in the quiet trust between human and animal that the cold would not claim them, at least not yet. In the medieval winter, food was more than nourishment. It was heat. It was survival. Peasants knew this instinctively. Every meal was planned not just to fill the stomach, but to warm the body from the inside. Hunger in winter was not a mild discomfort. It was dangerous. Cold without fuel could be deadly. The diet was simple. Heavy stews filled with root vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat formed the backbone of winter meals. Porridge, thick and warm, was eaten morning and evening. Bread was dense, dark, and often stale, but it provided energy that burned slowly. Ale was common, not the strong spirits we imagine today, but low-alcohol beer, safer than water in many villages. Warm ale could soothe the body and help it retain heat. But it was not a cure-all. It could make sleep feel warmer, but too much led to risk in the cold. Fats were precious. Lard, butter, and rendered animal fat were used sparingly, but they provided concentrated energy. Each bite carried warmth that lasted through the night. Peasants ate these slowly, deliberately, often with bread or porridge, stretching every bit of fuel their bodies could burn. Meals were timed carefully. Eating late in the evening was essential. The body needed fuel before long hours of inactivity. Digestion produced heat. A belly full of warm stew or porridge was a body shielded against the cold for at least a few hours. Every scrap mattered. Nothing was wasted. Stale bread might be soaked in broth. Leftover grains became porridge. Peasants understood the energy stored in every bite, and winter taught them the value of rationing. Hunger and scarcity were constant companions. Not every family had enough to eat. Many relied on what they could grow, store, or trade. When stores ran low, cold nights became even more dangerous. Yet, despite scarcity, food was also comfort. A hot meal brought not just physical warmth, but a small mental reassurance. Sitting near the fire, stirring a pot of thick stew, peasants found a moment of peace in the endless winter struggle. Even preparation of food became part of the night's ritual. Someone tended the fire to keep the stew simmering. Someone else chopped vegetables or kneaded dough. Movement created heat. Food preparation was both survival and resistance to the cold's slow creep. Alcohol had a complicated role. Myths claimed it could warm the body, but in reality, it caused heat to leave the skin faster. Still, in moderation, it added temporary comfort, both physical and psychological. Ale or small spirits were treated as a rare supplement to warmth, not a replacement. Meals were shared closely, often around the fire, with children and animals nearby. Eating together preserved heat and reinforced the sense of survival as a collective effort. Each bite was both nourishment and warmth, body and community intertwined. Even the simplest foods were strategic. Grain, potatoes, cabbage, root vegetables, and salted meat were staples. Fresh produce was rare in winter. Preservation mattered. Drying, smoking, salting, and pickling extended food life, giving peasants the ability to face the longest nights. In this way, food became a weapon against cold, not a magical one, but a practical, reliable tool. Each meal strengthened the body, stoked the fire within, and gave a few hours of protection against the relentless night. And when the hearth's fire dimmed and blankets were pulled tight around the sleeping family, the memory of warmth from food lingered. It became internal insulation, helping the body resist frost, shivering, and exhaustion. In medieval life, food and heat were inseparable. What you ate could save your life, and every meal was a quiet victory against the long, dark winter. Night in the medieval world was not quiet. It was long, it was dark, and it shaped every part of life. Without artificial light, Darkness ruled most of the day during winter. Peasants rose with the sun and went to bed long before it returned. But sleep itself was different from what we know today. Historians call it segmented sleep, a first sleep and a second sleep, with hours of wakefulness in between. Peasants might lie down after dusk, rest for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night. Some tended fires, checked animals, or quietly prayed. Others simply waited, watching the faint glow of embers. Sleep was functional. It was not always restful. The cold determined the rhythm. When the fire dimmed, blankets shifted, or wind pushed through cracks, bodies stirred. Hands and feet were checked. Straw mattresses were adjusted. The goal was always to conserve warmth, not to sleep deeply. During these long hours of darkness, quiet tasks helped pass the time. Chores were simple: mending tools, preparing food for morning, ensuring animals were safe. Every movement was calculated to conserve heat while avoiding unnecessary exertion. Prayers and storytelling were also part of the night. Family members whispered old tales, legends, and warnings passed down from generations. These narratives were more than entertainment. They offered reassurance, kept spirits focused, and reminded everyone that life persisted even in the darkness. Children learned to adapt. They were awake in the middle of the night sometimes, nestled against adults, watching shadows flicker on walls. They understood early that night was not a pause from danger. Cold, hunger, and the world outside waited patiently. Sleeping close together was essential. Body heat became a constant shared resource. The medieval night was alive with subtle sounds, the soft creak of beams as wood cooled, the rustle of straw and bedding, the low breathing of animals pressed nearby. Even the distant howl of wolves seemed closer in the silence. These sounds were reminders. Life persisted. The home was still holding back winter. Each noise confirmed warmth, presence, and survival. Light played a delicate role. A small fire or candle gave comfort, but too much light disturbed sleep and wasted precious fuel. Shadows flickering against walls could seem eerie, but families grew accustomed to them. Darkness itself became familiar, and survival depended on learning its patterns. The rhythm of night also shaped expectations. Peasants did not assume hours of uninterrupted sleep. They assumed wakefulness. Planning for moments of cold or hunger in the middle of the night was normal. Sleeping lightly, ready to respond, was the safest strategy. Even in the deepest part of winter, the medieval night had a structure. Darkness was long, sleep was segmented, awareness was constant, and yet, even with interruptions and discomfort, the night could feel safe if warmth, shelter, and community held together. By the first light of dawn, every movement, every shared breath, and every careful adjustment of fire and bedding had done its work. Families survived another long night, strengthened, ready to face the day ahead. Darkness was never just empty space. It was a force. It was a teacher. It demanded preparation, endurance, and attention. For medieval peasants, learning to live with the night was as important as working the fields or tending the animals. Sleep was not merely rest. It was another layer of survival, shaped entirely by cold, darkness, and the small comforts within the home. Night was not just cold, it was full of shadows and uncertainty. For medieval peasants, the darkness carried more than frost. It carried fear. The wind whistled through cracks, rattling shutters and loose roof thatch. The creaking of beams and the rustling of straw sounded like whispers. Wolves howled in distant forests. The night reminded everyone that survival was never guaranteed. In these moments, faith became warmth for the soul. Prayer was woven into the rhythm of night. Families recited prayers before sleep. Even during segmented sleep, Whispers of devotion filled the dark room. Invoking saints or asking for protection was a form of comfort as practical as blankets or fire. Fear and faith existed side by side. The unknown of the night was both real and imagined. Superstitions were common. People believed spirits roamed more freely in winter. Some feared demons, witches, or wandering souls. Strange noises were explained by folklore. A sudden shadow might be a ghost. A loud thump, a poltergeist. These beliefs were not just stories. They helped peasants explain the unexplained and feel some measure of control in a dangerous world. Storytelling became a vital defense. Around the hearth, families and neighbors passed tales from one generation to the next. Legends of clever animals, heroic saints, or dangerous spirits were shared not for entertainment alone, but to teach caution and keep children attentive. Even humor appeared. Silly tales and small jokes lightened the tension of darkness. Laughter, like warmth, spread quickly in crowded rooms. Community was also essential. A solitary night was frightening. A shared night, even in discomfort, was survivable. Neighbors exchanged food, firewood, or advice about tending animals. Shared labor before nightfall made cold evenings more bearable. People learned that survival was collective. Hope and warmth intertwined. Children absorbed all of this. They learned not only practical skills, but also emotional resilience. Faith and superstition offered tools for facing the unknown. Storytelling and prayer turned fear into ritual and ritual into endurance. Even adults leaned on these practices. They whispered quietly during waking hours, comforted one another when fear rose, and took comfort in familiar routines. Darkness could feel endless, but repetition and preparation made it manageable. Hope was a survival strategy. Belief, ritual, and community became shields against the psychological weight of night. Peasants understood that the cold was dangerous, but loneliness and despair were equally lethal. Faith, fear, and storytelling were inseparable from warmth. They reminded everyone that life continued, that morning would come, and that survival was possible even in the harshest conditions. And when dawn eventually approached, the longest nights had been endured, the spirits calmed, and the family, strengthened by shared vigilance and belief, was ready for another day. In medieval life, emotional survival was just as vital as physical survival. Prayer, superstition, and community created the inner heat that carried people through darkness, reinforcing the lessons of endurance taught by fire, straw, and body warmth. For medieval peasants, night was never a time to fully rest. Even when darkness fell and the fire dimmed, work continued quietly, carefully, and often urgently. Animals needed tending. Cows, goats, pigs, they could not wait for daylight. A neglected cow could freeze to death. A goat left outside might wander or fall prey to predators. Every creature depended on human care, even during the coldest hours. The fire itself demanded attention. Embers had to be stirred, logs carefully added, and smoke monitored. A hearth that died could leave a family shivering and vulnerable. Checking the fire was a nightly ritual, repeated multiple times, often by whoever woke first. Winter storms brought emergencies, roofs leaked, thatch coverings shifted under snow. A heavy wind could break beams or shutters. Someone had to respond immediately, even in the middle of the night, or risk injury, property damage, or the cold spreading unchecked. Food preparation continued as well. Meals were carefully rationed, cooked slowly near the fire. Stews simmered for hours. Porridge needed stirring. Bread and ale were monitored to ensure they lasted through the long night. Every decision affected survival. Sometimes repairs were necessary for tools and equipment. Wooden handles cracked, ropes frayed, Tools were sharpened or reinforced by candlelight. Winter slowed growth, but it did not stop the labor that kept a household alive. Movement was deliberate. Every step wasted energy and warmth, yet staying still could allow frostbite or chill to set in. Peasants learned to balance activity and rest. Minimal motion, when paired with body heat and proximity to fire, could sustain them through long nights. Even in sleep, vigilance remained. Families slept together not only for warmth, but to ensure someone would notice emergencies. If an animal panicked, if a fire faltered, or if a roof groaned too loudly, someone would be awake to act. The cold taught patience and attention. Work became a quiet, careful negotiation with the night. Children helped where they could. Small hands gathered wood, arranged straw, or fed animals. Every action contributed to warmth and survival. They learned early that winter was demanding, and their role, however minor, mattered. Adults bore the weight of responsibility. They understood that every neglected ember, every forgotten animal could mean disaster. Fatigue was constant, but so was awareness. Rest was fragmented. Sleep was segmented. Vigilance became part of the rhythm of life. Even simple tasks were acts of endurance. Carrying water from a frozen stream, chopping wood in the dark, mending worn clothing under candlelight. Every action was measured against the cold and the long hours ahead. Winter nights were relentless. They tested patience, strength, and endurance. But through constant attention, practical knowledge, and shared effort, peasants managed to survive, night after night, year after year. The lesson of winter work was clear. Survival required motion, vigilance, and responsibility, even when the world was dark and frozen. Rest was rare. Warmth had to be earned. Life continued quietly, with constant effort, until the first light of dawn promised another chance to endure. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Medieval peasants lived with the constant risk of illness. Winter nights were long, and cold crept into every corner of life. Frostbite, hypothermia, and respiratory diseases were common threats. The weak, the elderly, and infants were the most vulnerable. Survival was never guaranteed. When the body grew chilled, illness could set in quickly. Hands and feet stiffened, joints ached, breathing slowed. In homes without proper ventilation, smoke and damp worsened the risk. A simple cold could spiral into pneumonia, which often proved fatal. Nutrition was another factor. Food scarcity in winter meant that bodies lacked the energy needed to fight cold and disease. Hunger weakened immunity. Even a well-fed family struggled when frost covered the land for weeks. Death was part of life. Peasants understood it intimately. Families accepted mortality as a reality, not a tragedy. Infants sometimes did not survive the first harsh winter. Elders, worn down by decades of work, often succumbed quietly. There were no hospitals, no modern medicine, no warmth beyond the home to save them. Burial was difficult. Frozen ground made digging graves laborious. Communities sometimes delayed burials or reused graves in ways that seem unimaginable today. Life and death existed side by side, and winter made the gap between them painfully narrow. Illness and death shaped behavior. Peasants cared for the sick with whatever resources were available: warm blankets, proximity to fire, and careful feeding. Comfort was limited, but survival required attentiveness. A dying ember could mean a dead body. Warmth was life. Cold nights demanded awareness. Even healthy people were at risk if fire faltered, clothing failed, or animals moved unexpectedly. Survival required constant attention, quick responses, and practical knowledge. Stories of survival and death passed from one generation to the next. Children were taught which signs of illness required care and which indicated fatal risk. They learned early that winter could kill quietly, and that caution was essential. Despite the dangers, life persisted. Communities adapted. Houses were shared, animals brought indoors, fires tended carefully, and food rationed with skill. Each measure, each small decision, worked against the inevitable, delaying the claim of cold and illness as long as possible. Even in the face of death, the world remained tangible. Breath misted in the air, straw rustled under shifting bodies, fires glowed faintly. The living continued to survive, holding on until daylight. The coldest nights were tests of endurance, resilience, and human ingenuity. They reminded peasants that life was fragile and that survival required constant vigilance. Death was close, but warmth, work, and community offered a shield, however thin, against it. Medieval peasants did not romanticize these nights. They understood the harsh realities. Survival was not heroic in the way stories would later tell. It was practical, patient, and unyielding. And in this world, where frost could end a life in hours, every ember, every layer of clothing, every shared body heat, and every careful act mattered. The night was unforgiving, but it could be endured if humans remembered the rules winter had taught them for centuries. In the harsh winter of the medieval world, no peasant survived alone. Cold was relentless, and danger was constant. Community was not optional. It was survival itself. Villages were small, but their bonds were strong. Neighbors shared more than stories. They shared firewood, food, advice, and warmth. When winter storms blocked paths, villagers checked on one another. An elderly widow might receive a basket of porridge from a neighbor. A family with extra straw might lend it to a friend whose floors had frozen hard. These acts were not charity. They were investments in collective survival. Fires were sometimes shared. In the coldest nights, families might gather around a single hearth. Extra bodies meant extra warmth, and together they could endure what one household alone could not. Humans, animals, and fire all worked in concert, amplified by proximity and cooperation. Knowledge passed quickly through the community. Someone might know the best way to patch a leaky roof. Another knew how to preserve a small stash of grain, or to smoke meat effectively. Tips about clothing repairs, fire management, or straw placement could mean the difference between comfort and sickness, or even life and death. Children learned this from an early age. Play was not separate from survival. They watched elders interact, learning who to trust, what practices mattered, and how to behave during long nights. Responsibility began young. Even small contributions, like fetching a log for the fire or helping feed animals, reinforced the lesson that no one was truly self-sufficient. Village solidarity extended beyond immediate neighbors. During extreme storms or severe cold, multiple households collaborated. Fires were stoked together, food shared strategically, the sick were monitored. Collective work, even under exhaustion, created a network of resilience. Isolation meant danger. Being alone could be fatal. Community also provided emotional support. Darkness could heighten fear, and cold could erode patience and hope. Families huddled together not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Laughter, storytelling, and shared prayer reinforced mental endurance. A neighbor's presence made the night less threatening. Even rituals and celebrations were part of survival. Seasonal gatherings, simple feasts, or shared prayers around the hearth created bonds. These moments of unity reminded everyone that they were not alone in facing winter's cruelty. The mental warmth of community was as important as the fire's heat. The reality of medieval life was stark. Survival depended on observation, skill, and relationships. Every neighbor, every shared meal, every piece of firewood mattered. Villages endured because their members understood that cooperation was essential. One weak link could jeopardize everyone, and centuries of experience taught them to strengthen bonds. And so, even in the coldest nights, life persisted. Hearths glowed in multiple homes, animals rustled nearby, and voices whispered across the dark. Communities became living shields against the elements, turning individual vulnerability into collective resilience. Medieval peasants survived together. They endured not just through fire, straw, or clothing, but through each other. Winter was harsh, but humans had learned to face it as one. The sun had long disappeared behind the hills. Darkness settled over the village like a heavy blanket. Frost glistened faintly on rooftops, and the wind whispered through the trees. Inside a small wattle and daub home, the hearth glowed with the last embers of a carefully tended fire. Smoke drifted lazily upward, curling into the roof. The air smelled of straw, wool, and wood smoke, the familiar scent of survival. A peasant family gathered close. Parents, children, and a small grandparent huddled together on a straw-filled mattress, layered with wool blankets. Their bodies pressed against one another, sharing warmth in the only way that mattered. Cows and goats slept nearby, their breath mixing with the human occupants, adding a faint, steady heat to the room. Every rustle of straw, every sigh, every gentle nudge reminded the family that life was present, even in the darkness. The youngest child, barely old enough to walk, nestled against the mother. Tiny hands clutched the coarse fabric of her tunic, eyes wide as the night whispered around the home. The father leaned against the wall, monitoring the fire with careful attention. Embers were shifted, logs added sparingly, smoke rising in controlled spirals. Outside, wolves prowled quietly. Their howls carried across the frozen fields, a reminder that danger existed just beyond the walls. Inside, the fire, the animals, and the bodies pressed together created a fragile but sufficient shield. The mother whispered a short prayer, eyes closed, hoping for another night survived. The child listened, learning that words could bring comfort when warmth alone was not enough. The father's hand moved over the straw mattress, smoothing lumps, adjusting bedding to trap as much heat as possible. Every small action mattered. Some chores continued quietly. Water was carried in small jugs from the frozen well. Grain was checked for spoilage. Tools were positioned near the fire to prevent frost damage. Even the act of moving was calculated. Energy was precious, and exertion meant burning warmth too quickly. The night stretched on. The fire dimmed, only glowing faintly, yet it was enough. Family members shifted slightly, adjusting to keep warm, breathing together, their rhythms synchronized by survival. Laughter and whispers punctuated the quiet, small stories told to keep spirits alive. Outside, the wind's howl grew louder. Snow drifted silently across the fields. Inside, the smell of animals, wool, and straw filled the senses. Cold was present, pressing against every wall, every floor, every thin window shutter. But it could not penetrate the circle of warmth created by the family and their hearth. Hours passed. Some family members stirred to tend the fire or reposition blankets. Some rose briefly to check on animals or smooth the bedding. Sleep was fragmented but present. Darkness was heavy, but life persisted. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the family emerged from the night intact. Fingers stiff, feet cold, but alive. The fire still smoldered. The animals still breathed. Survival had been achieved, quietly, steadily, and without fanfare. This single night, repeated countless times across centuries, defined the endurance of medieval peasants. Life was measured not in comfort, but in the careful management of warmth, bodies, fire, and community. Each sound, each touch, Each small act of vigilance mattered. Medieval life was harsh. Nights were long, cold, and unforgiving. But the combination of human ingenuity, shared warmth, and quiet resilience allowed life to continue, one night at a time. And as dawn spread pale light over frost-covered fields, the family rose together, ready to face another day, carrying with them the warmth of survival from the night before. The night had passed. The frost still clung to rooftops and fields, but the fire had burned through the long hours, and the family had survived. Looking back, medieval peasants left lessons that modern life often forgets. Warmth was not taken for granted. Comfort was earned through effort, care, and attention. Every layer of clothing, every straw-strewn floor, every shared breath was part of survival. We live in a world of constant warmth and artificial light. We rarely notice the miracle of central heating, insulated homes, or soft beds. For peasants, these were luxuries beyond reach. They endured cold not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a constant companion. Survival depended on mindfulness. Every small choice mattered. Clothes were repaired, fires tended, straw arranged, animals sheltered. Communities shared resources and knowledge. Life demanded attention, patience, and endurance. The cold was a teacher. It taught vigilance, resourcefulness, and resilience. It taught people to value warmth, both physical and emotional. Even in darkness, comfort was found in small ways. A shared bed, a whispered prayer, a story told by the fire. These were victories against the night. Each act of care strengthened the bonds between people, between humans and animals, between life and the elements. We can learn from this today. Modern warmth may be constant, but the value of attention, effort, and human connection is timeless. Endurance is still needed, not against frost perhaps, but against the challenges of life that require patience, care, and resilience. The cold past also reminds us to respect the natural world. Straw, earth, wool, and fire all came from careful use of what was available. Nothing was wasted. Every resource was precious. There is a quiet wisdom in such simplicity, in living in balance with what surrounds us. And finally, the cold teaches gratitude for warmth, for shelter, for food, for the gentle presence of others beside us as night falls. Medieval peasants lived with fragility and danger every night, yet they endured. They found comfort where they could. They survived together. As you settle into your own bed tonight, think of the lessons from long ago. Appreciate the warmth around you, the comfort you often take for granted, and the quiet strength of endurance. Cold was once an enemy. Now it is a teacher. And like the medieval peasants, we can face the darkness with care, patience, and quiet resilience, letting warmth, both physical and human, carry us gently into sleep.